Hello and welcome to Virtual CoastFest 2021, coming to you live from the Georgia DNR's Coastal Regional Office in Brunswick. I'm Leah King-Bedina with Keep Golden Isles Beautiful, your guest host for today. I'm excited to be here with Paul and Cameron of DNR's Coastal Resources Division. So Paul, let's get started with you. Tell us what you do here at Coastal Resources.
Okay, so I am the unit lead for the group that does the artificial reefs and so we do inshore and offshore artificial reefs, we do oyster restoration, and we do public access, which includes the like boat ramps and fishing piers and that stuff.
There's quite a lot you have under your belt, that's for sure.
Yep.
And Cameron, tell us what you do here at Coastal Resources.
So I'm a marine biologist that works with Paul with the artificial reefs. Primarily, I focus more on the inshore artificial reefs and the oyster restoration that we do. But I help out through all the projects that we do in our unit.
Well, I know that you guys have some really cool things happening in your divisions, and I understand that you've prepared a video for all of us to see today. So let's watch it together.
Georgia's marine fish play an essential role in keeping the ecosystems of our state's inshore and offshore ocean habitats healthy. That's why the Coastal Resources Division of the Georgia Department of Natural Resources does our best to make sure fish have a place to thrive. Many types of fish all over the world live in special ecosystems called reefs. You may have heard of Australia's Great Barrier Reef or Gray's Reef right off the coast of Georgia. These are natural reefs formed as marine life like corals and sea fans cling to hard surfaces and rock formations, or even the hardened remains of previous corals. Georgia's coastline is made up of sand, shell, and mud. The underwater landscape looks much like what you see at the beach at low tide. This sandy bottom stretches for many miles out to the continental shelf edge. There are not really many places for fish to hide in a flat, open environment like this. They need a protected space to feed and spawn. That's where the Coastal Resources Division comes in with something called an artificial reef. An artificial reef mimics natural formations like the Great Barrier Reef and Gray's Reef to provide fish with a place to live in areas where they might not have otherwise been able to. In order to build an artificial reef, we provide structures where fish can hide from predators and will attract other types of marine life into the neighborhood. And while the structure itself is man-made or artificial, the reef that forms from this formation is totally natural. Big chunks of rocks and even steel and concrete are obvious materials to build reef foundations. But did you know we've also made reefs out of surplus army tanks, old metal bridges, and retired ships? Almost any substantial surface that is clean, free from toxins, and won't trap animals can be used. Fish can find their new home here right away. And within a year, encrusting organisms like coral and algae and barnacles will attract themselves to these surfaces. Sea turtles love these new hiding places. After a time, the reef will create its own self-sustaining ecosystem where every organism plays a role in the food chain. Artificial reefs in Georgia's inshore marshes are similar, but instead of being located far out into the ocean, they can be found in our tidal creeks and rivers. They can enhance areas that lack suitable habitat for fish and provide increased recreational fishing opportunities. While offshore, Coastal Resources Division may create reefs from large items like ships, the inshore reefs are made from smaller materials. Concrete structures like fish aggregation devices, such as reef balls, have been placed all across Georgia's inshore coastline to promote healthy fish habitat. Inshore artificial reefs not only provide habitat for fish, but for oysters as well. Oysters are known as a keystone species. This means that oysters are so important to habitat that if they're taken away, the entire ecosystem would stop working. As filter feeders, oysters are able to filter out man-made pollutants and naturally occurring bacteria. Oysters have the ability to clean about 2.5 gallons of water every hour, making their job very important. Oysters prefer to build their mounds upon their own shells, so while surfaces like rocks and concrete make great inshore fish habitat, we often choose to recycle discarded oyster shells back into the ecosystem. Oyster shells can be used to restore and enhance oyster reefs. To rehabilitate an oyster reef, oyster shells are collected together in net bags so they can be handled. These bags of oyster shells are placed along the edge of a tidal creek as new oysters grow on the old ones. The mounds grow as they mature into adults. The revitalized mounds help protect the shoreline by acting as a buffer against wave action along the creek. The healthy reef will also provide additional fish habitat. Building homes for fish is an essential part of maintaining a healthy inshore marsh system and a healthy habitat along Georgia's coast. We hope you've enjoyed learning about the Inshore and Offshore Reef Program.
What a great video. And as a quick reminder, you can ask questions via Facebook and YouTube. So while you're sending those questions in, we'll go ahead and get started with a few of our own. So how deep and where is our deepest artificial reef? Or not how deep is it? How deep is it and where is it? Yes, that's right.
Certainly. So our deepest reef is DW Reef, or Deepwater Reef, which is about 70 miles offshore of Sapelo Island, east of Sapelo Island, and that's 170 feet deep at its deepest. About the farthest from shore that you can get for one of our artificial reefs.
70 miles is a pretty far way out there, so that's good to know that you guys work to that distance from our shoreline. Our next question, what would happen without reefs?
So if you were to be able to pull the water back and look at the bottom of the ocean offshore Georgia, it really would look like the beach at low tide, like just low sloping sand. And so our artificial reefs are built to have a place for reef organisms to grow, to attract fish. So if we didn't have those reefs, there would be less fish habitat and in theory less fish. And you kind of have to contrast that artificial reef with some of our natural reefs. We do have some areas offshore where the reefs are growing on limestone, and those are the perfectly natural reefs. And then our artificial reefs are, I like to tell people that the reef itself is natural, but the substrate's artificial. So we're trying to mimic the natural reef, but then we have more of it. So we have more habitat for fish and more fish for anglers to catch and all of that sort of.
That's an interesting comparison of how you just compared the bottom of the ocean and why it's different here in Georgia. So thank you for that. Next question, can we scuba dive on the reefs? That's a really good question.
That's a great question.
Certainly, yes. You can definitely scuba dive on our reefs. I just went out several times in the last couple of weeks to go scuba diving on them to monitor the material on the reefs. It can be a little bit cloudy at some of the nearshore reefs, depending on what the weather and tides are doing at those areas. But as you get further offshore, you get into some very clear water, and there's lots of interesting materials for you to dive on out there.
That would be really neat to see some of the things that we saw in the video that you guys have used to construct the reef. So that would be a wonderful experience when diving. What type of fish likes the reefs? Who hangs out there? Tell us about the fish that hang out at the reefs.
So we're talking about like fish communities, like the benthic community, the fish that live on the bottom. There'll be all the groupers and snappers and black sea bass and flounder and those type fish. And then you'll have fish we call pelagic fish that swim in the water column. And like a pelagic fish would be something like a king mackerel or a cobia or a sailfish even, something like that. And they come in more seasonally for us. And then we also from time to time get tropical fish that come up from further south. And so you'll see things like you would see, you'd expect to see in a Caribbean reef. And they're here seasonally when the water's warmer. But there's all sorts of fish that you can see out there.
Looks like we have a question, so thank you for that answer. The question is, are the corals that grow on these artificial reefs the same kind as grows in Florida, or are they a different type? That is a fabulous question.
That's a great
from
question.
Nick Harris. Thank you.
So our reefs do have hard corals on them like you would see in the Caribbean. They're not predominantly hard corals like they are in the Caribbean. Some of our reefs that are 40 years old or older, you see a lot of hard corals, but we're really made up of things like sponges and sea whips and sea fans and other encrusting organisms that, so we just look different. I heard a researcher say recently, though, that our reefs have a lot more biodiversity than the Caribbean reefs do, so we got a lot more other stuff going on. So we're not as much about the hard corals, but we are 3D structured things growing like you saw in that video.
And since we don't have a lot of those hard corals, the only places that you see the reefs are places where there's something like a limestone outcropping or a material that we put out there. You don't have corals growing on top of corals and providing their own foundation. So spatially, we're a lot more restricted in where our corals are.
That's a great point.
Well, that leads me to our next question, which is, where do you get the tanks and subway cars that you have used for some of these artificial reefs?
Yeah, so the tanks and subway cars were both donated to us from government organizations. The tanks came from a surplus program with the military where they were getting rid of vehicles and ships and so forth. And the subway cars came from the New York Transit Authority. A lot of our materials are materials of opportunity, things that are donated to us that have gone past their usable lifespan or are being structures that are being demolished to make way for something new. So a bridge gets torn down, we might get some of the foundations and the structure of that bridge. Local cities replacing the culvert in a section, we might get that batch of culvert and so forth. Basically, it can be any item that is durable in salt water, is heavy enough to stay put, and is free of contaminants, and is not a danger to the entrapment of animals and divers. So, for things like ships, that means that we remove all sources of oil and gasoline, like the engines and the gas tanks and so forth. All the hatches get cut off or welded open so they can't swing closed and trap something in there.
This is a particularly fascinating part of what you all do to me, and very exciting to think about all the different materials that are used. It looks like we have another question. So the question is from yesterday's host, Joe Willie Sousa, and he's asking, is it okay for me to use oysters for my Christmas wreath? No lights, Joe Willie. Is it okay for me to use oysters? And this is really good because we're about to segue into talking about oysters, so you can answer his question.
It's always fun to use natural things to build, repurpose things and build wreaths. It's great. Now, we do like to talk about recycling of oyster shell and how after you have an oyster roast that you can bring them we have a place right outside of our building where you can bring your shells for recycling, and then we put them back in the environment so oysters can grow on them. So I wouldn't say it's bad to build a Christmas wreath. I think it's I see a lot of people do mirrors and all sorts of things with oyster shell, and that's really cool, but it is good to recycle them. I'd rather see Joe Willie build a wreath out of it than I would see them be thrown in the trash can. I'll say that. So.
Well, while we're talking about oysters, we have a question that asks, how long do oysters live? So let's speak to that.
Certainly. So oysters live up to about 20 years of age. Now, they mature much quicker than that, depending on the conditions they're living in, somewhere between 1 to 3 years before they start reproducing. But they can live quite a long time.
20 years is a lot older than what I would have thought.
Yeah, it's an old oyster.
Looks like we have another question. So how many artificial reefs do you manage? From Caitlin.
Okay, so our artificial reefs offshore, we have 31 offshore artificial reefs that we manage. That's from the ones closest to the beach we call beach reefs. We've got some nearshore reefs that are in the 7 to 10 mile range. Then some reefs that are about 18 to 20 miles offshore. And then there's some that are in that 20 to 30 mile range. And then the ones Cameron was speaking of to begin with that are like 70 miles offshore, the ones that are way far out there. But that's the offshore artificial reefs. And you want to speak to the inshore artificial reefs?
Certainly. So we've got 15 inshore artificial reefs spread out throughout the coastal counties. These reefs are a little bit different in character from the offshore ones. You don't see as much of your corals and things on them. The areas that are subtidal, that are exposed or that never get exposed during low tide, you'll get some corals, but a lot of what grows on these reefs are oysters, and they're providing great fish habitat, providing crevices for small prey items like little crabs and crustaceans, and small fish to take shelter in, and larger fish to forage on, and also creating eddies for fish to take shelter from the currents and take a rest as our very strong tidal currents come through.
So I think it's important to keep in mind that we're building these artificial reefs usually in areas where they're not structures. And so we're building these reefs. They create fish habitat, a place for fish to live, and they create angling opportunities, a place for fishermen to fish. So it's kind of sort of a dual purpose. There's a lot of side benefits, like Cameron's mentioning oysters. They're filtering water. They'll keep your water clean. They're doing all kinds of other environmental type services. So there's a lot going on at all these reefs. It's really, really exciting, diverse places.
And serving more than one purpose.
That's right. And there's lots of natural reefs that function the same way. So, but yeah, it's just we're trying to fill in some of those gaps of places where we don't have reefs.
Connect it all together.
That's right.
So we have another question. How long, we're going to switch back to oysters. How long does it take for an oyster to reach maturity?
So that's about 1 to 3 years for them to reach maturity. Now, this depends on a couple different factors: how warm the water is, how much of the tidal cycle they are underwater. Where the oyster lives on the bank is sort of a cost-benefit sort of thing for the oysters, because if they are deeper in the water, they have water over them for more parts of the day and can be eating and growing more, but they're also more exposed to predators. Whereas one that's higher up on the reef has less opportunity to eat, but is more sheltered from things like sheep's head and other fish that will come by and eat them, particularly when they're young. So there's definitely a happy medium for oysters.
That's a great point. People may not realize that when the tide goes out, and that oyster may spend 6 hours outside with the water being below it, but it's closed up and it's alive in there. They're very hardy creatures because it can be so warm, and then the tide comes back in and covers them up, and they open back up a little bit and start feeding. So yeah, it's an important point that when you ride by and see those oysters out of the water, they're all alive when they're that brownish green color. They're alive. They can stand those summer heat and all those being out of the water and hold that water inside their shell. So.
And anybody driving around coastal Georgia is seeing the oyster beds that you're talking about out in the marshes. Okay, another question. How can we help in the development of artificial reefs? What can we do?
Certainly. So there are a number of ways that you can help us in our program with the oyster restoration. In particular, you can donate any shell that you get to our shell recycling program, or support restaurants that partner with us for shell recycling. So if you're going to a restaurant and ordering oyster off the menu, ask them if they're recycling their shell, and that's a big help for us. We get a lot of our shell from the restaurants. You can also buy one of our marine habitat license plate, marine habitat restoration license plates, and that money comes to us, and we use it for a number of different projects, from oyster restoration to offshore artificial reef development. A couple of the ships that were in the video that we watched earlier were paid for by that license plate.
And what happens with the recycled oyster shells? Why is that important?
Certainly, yeah. So the way that the oyster's life cycle goes is the adult oysters will release eggs and sperm into the water column, where they'll get fertilized, and they'll swim around for a couple of weeks as a free-floating larvae, and then they start looking for someplace hard to settle on and live out the rest of their life. And here in Georgia, we're blessed with an abundance of larval oyster in the water, but they're very limited on the amount of hard structure that's out there. And oyster shell is an ideal substrate for them to settle on. So creating a new oyster reef is mostly a matter of picking a location that's suitable for oysters and putting out oyster shell or some other suitable hard structure for them to settle on. And so we take the shell that's been collected through our recycling program and put it out, and in less than a year we have a stable, self-sustaining natural reef that has been colonized by those wild oysters.
And as you just mentioned, that each of us can help by, when we're going out to eat and have oysters, asking the restaurant if they recycle the oysters. And if the answer is no, then asking them to give Coastal Resources Division a call and get involved in the oyster recycling program. That's an easy way for each of us to help with this whole entire project.
That's a great point. I'd like to go back to the marine habitat license plate Cameron mentioned, just so we can maybe clarify that. That's a license plate you get for your vehicle, and when you go to the county tag office to renew your license plate for your vehicle, you can ask for the marine habitat license plate. There's a $25 fee associated with that plate. You get one to go on your car, and then every year when you renew it, that money that you're buying with that plate comes back to support that oyster restoration and artificial reef work. That's a great, easy way. That and buying a hunting and fishing license is a great way you can support us too, because some of our federal money is tied to how many fishing licenses we sell. So all those things are easy things you can do that don't take a lot of work at all.
And the car tags are beautiful. They're great looking car tags. Anybody would be proud to have one on their vehicle. Okay, another question about oysters. What do oysters eat? We talk about us eating oysters, but what do they eat?
So oysters are filter feeders, and so they're eating phytoplankton and zooplankton out of the water column. They're filtering it through, which is a good thing. But and while doing that, they also filter the water. An individual oyster can filter about 50 gallons of water per day. So they provide what we call an ecosystem service of keeping waters clean. They're keeping that phytoplankton level down. They will also take up toxins out of the water and things like that. That's why it's important if you are planning to eat oysters that you do that from one of our approved public picking areas, because water quality is important. Because if the water quality is bad for some reason, pollutants or something in the water, the oysters will take that up. So you got to be sure you're eating oysters from an approved area. And all the commercial harvest areas, all the oysters you're buying in any restaurant or any seafood market are all coming from an area, whether it's our state or another state, where they keep the water quality in check. They check the water quality because there's a big human health concerns. But yeah, oysters are not only good to eat, but you are eating the things that they eat, so you need to be conscious of that.
Those are all good points to remember. And while we're talking about oysters, I have another question. Are there male and female oysters?
Yes, there are male and female oysters. However, it's not a simple A or B answer for them, depending on the environmental conditions. Oysters can change what sex they are throughout their lifetime. So they might start out a male and transition to a female.
So oysters are very interesting, and they serve a really great purpose here in our coastal area. And I'd like to turn the questions back to you all for a minute. Tell me, Cameron, how did you get started in this field and end up where you are?
Certainly. So I've always had a passion for the outdoors and camping and fishing and hunting. When I was going into my bachelor's degree at the University of West Georgia, I thought I was going to be doing freshwater biology. But after I graduated, followed my wife down to the coast and couldn't stay away from science, and started volunteering in a lab at the Savannah State University, and found out I really liked the coastal environment too, and ended up getting my master's there, and here I am working in marine biology now.
And the rest is history.
The rest is history, yep. Been working in my current job for about 3 years now, and was doing part-time work for the department for a few years before that, as I was finishing my master's degree.
That's a really great journey. And Paul, tell us, how did you end up here? What's your background?
I'm like Cameron. I really enjoy the outdoors. I enjoy the hunting and fishing and doing all that. Grew up doing that. I grew up dipping water out of the ditch to see what was in the water all the time. That's something I did as a kid. And then, you know, I'm a local boy. I went to high school here, to Brunswick High, and then I went to the local college. We called it back then Brunswick College, not the College of Coastal Georgia, but the same place. And then I moved on to Armstrong State College up in Savannah, and I graduated with a degree in biology, and I came back here to work. Started out on a grant that was only going to last for a few years, and just sort of transitioned from job to job. And you flash forward 27 years, and here I sit, still doing it, and love it. It's just it's a lot of fun. It's a great job. I never really thought I would be a marine biologist and be a biologist of some kind, but it's been a lot of fun over the years, learning and doing stuff and helping protect Georgia's awesome coastal resources.
Well, you both seem to really enjoy what you do and believe in what you do, and that makes us as a state happy that you're working for us in that capacity and helping our coastal resources. And that's the end of our questions. And before we sign off, we want to give a great big shout out to St. Francis and Needwood Middle School for the wonderful CoastFest art displays you see back here. They've done a great job. Thank you both, Paul and Cameron, for talking to us about what you do and our changing beaches. And lastly, thank you to all of you for sending in questions. And please join us again tomorrow morning at 8:45 as we discuss green growth. And thank you for being a part of Virtual CoastFest 2021.